Good finish for the Dogs in 2020. They hope to extend in 2021, where Mike Leach finally has a complete offseason to get his offense and defense ready for the SEC. Welcome to the Voice of College Football. We got Daniel Black on the line from MSU Bulldog Blitz. Daniel, how we doing today?
Pretty good, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. Let's run through the offense and the defense. The Dogs have been in camp, about 10 days, something in that range?
Sounds about right.
Will Rogers, of course, threw 11 touchdowns, 7 picks in his time as mostly the starter in 2020 after KJ Costello put up the big numbers in week 1 and then faded from there. Your thoughts about development of Will Rogers and what Mike Leach is saying in that direction?
Sure. There's sort of been an ongoing quarterback battle. It's been a story of the offseason for Mississippi State. It's definitely the number one offseason story for Mississippi State's offense between Will Rogers and Jack Abraham. Jack Abraham is a graduate transfer from Southern Miss. And there have been a lot of people. Mike Leach has been adamant that the quarterback position is totally open. It is not Will Rogers. It's been an ongoing battle between Rogers and Abraham, but recently, Jack Abraham has sustained some sort of injury. Rumors say it's a concussion. There's nothing official on that front, so I'm not going to say that for sure. But he's missed camp for about the last week or so. He's missed the last few practices. And as that's been going on, it's becoming kind of evident, at least within some of the circles around the Mississippi State football program, that it is right now Will Rogers' position to lose. Maybe around 70% sure at this point that Will Rogers is going to be the starter, and more than likely, if Jack Abraham stays out, that number is just going to get greater and greater. So it's looking more and more likely that Will Rogers will be the starting quarterback, at least at the beginning of the season in 2021. And in terms of his skill set and what Mississippi State's looking to see from him, it's just maybe just more consistency. I mean, there were points last year where Will Rogers looked like a true freshman. He was sort of thrown into the fire midway through the year when KJ Costello started to struggle and he went down with injury in the Alabama game. Will Rogers' first action at quarterback at Mississippi State, he started a little bit played a little bit at Kentucky, but then in terms of significant playing time, he was playing in front of however many fans at Bryant-Denny Stadium against Alabama. So he was really thrown into the fire pretty quickly into the season and just developed. He didn't look great against Alabama, didn't look great in the win against Vanderbilt, but he looked like a legit SEC quarterback against Georgia, had his moment against Ole Miss, had a really good game against Missouri, and looked solid in the bowl game against Tulsa. So Mississippi State's just looking to build upon that end-of-season surge that Will Rogers had and maybe get him more consistent. I mean, last season, you mentioned he had 11 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. I'm sure Mike Leach and the Mississippi State coaches are wanting Will Rogers to have a bit more difference in that number, more touchdowns and fewer interceptions. So he had a really good completion percentage, 69.1%, completed 69% of his passes. So if he can maybe stay around that range and just have more consistency in terms of making better decisions, I think Mississippi State will be in good hands.
Again, you're talking about a complete offensive overhaul from 2019. Mike Leach steps in and spring practice is interrupted, and then it all goes from there in regards to everybody and what they had to face. But for a first-year head coach and trying to implement a new system, terminology, the whole deal, now he's got the complete offseason, and they had a good stretch drive against Mizzou and Tulsa. We got Daniel Black on the line from MSU Bulldog Blitz, breaking down the Dogs. So it's the natural transition period, but especially in a Mike Leach offense that we'll talk quarterbacks, then go right to the wide receivers. The top 2 pass catchers are back, but one's a running back. Jaden Wally's a really good one at 52 catches last season. What's the rest of the core look like?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Jaden Wally. He's definitely going to be the leader of this wide receiver core. All eyes are going to be on him from last year. Started out slow, wasn't really a very big factor in the Mississippi State wide receiving core at the beginning of the year last year, but came on strong, multiple 100-yard games. He's definitely going to be the leader of this receiving core. Some other names: Austin Williams is one. He is the most experienced receiver in this group. It seems like he's been on Mississippi State's team for the past 6 or 7 years at this point. It seems like one of those 7-year seniors that you see occasionally. Obviously, he's not that, but he's definitely the most experienced in the group. Had 43 receptions last year for 372 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's definitely one of the more dependable receivers on Mississippi State's receiving core, and will probably get a lot more catches next year. Lee Keith is another name that Mississippi State fans and people who will be watching Mississippi State this year will be looking at. Another name that didn't have a whole lot of production last year, but has the potential and the talent to make a massive step up list this year is Tulu Griffin. Last year, he only had 6 receptions for 61 yards, but he made a name for himself in the return game last year, especially in the bowl game against Tulsa. Had a kick return for a touchdown in that game, but he's someone who Mississippi State's coaching staff is really looking to take a step up. And 2 receivers, one redshirted last season and another just didn't play last year. 2 receivers that have really been making names for themselves in training camp that will more than likely be pretty significant contributors to this offense is Mekhi Polk and Rufus Harvey. Rufus Harvey is from Starkville. He was someone who Mississippi State, when Mike Leach was first hired, didn't have an offer from Mississippi State until Mike Leach got hired. And then shortly thereafter, shortly before signing day, Rufus Harvey got an offer. And it's something that a lot of Mississippi State people were sort of clamoring for because he was very, very talented out of Starkville High. He was someone who dealt with COVID issues last year. He had it himself and then dealt with contact tracing and then actually got injured later on in the year. So he never got the opportunity to play. But he's someone who a lot of people are pointing to as a potential significant contributor in 2021. He's been making a name for himself in camp, as well as Mekhi Polk, who I mentioned earlier. So those are just some names in the receiving core that I think Mississippi State will be depending on this coming season.
Got Daniel Black on the line from MSU Bulldog Blitz, breaking down the Dogs as they prepare for the SEC and get underway on September 4th, along with just about everybody else. Louisiana Tech is week 1 in Starkville. All right. Not too out of the ordinary here. Leading rusher for a Mike Leach offense at 312 yards rushing, but also that same said running back catching 60 passes out of the backfield, even in a short season. So that's pretty indicative of Mike Leach on both ends of that. Got to run the ball once in a while. But at the same time, using those running backs out of the backfield as pass catchers.
That's right. Mississippi State's got a duo of running backs who they will be depending on. They got some playing time last year, a lot more playing time towards the end of the year. Obviously, a year ago, all eyes were on Kylan Hill as the starting running back. But by the end of the season, he was no longer with the team. So Mississippi State pointed to 2 running backs led by Jaquavius Marks. He has been the first game against LSU. He only got 3 carries for 15 yards. But if you look at his stat line, he became a lot more involved in the offense. Got 10 rushes against Arkansas, 9 against Alabama, 12 against Missouri, 11 against Tulsa. And once again, those aren't really usually a lot of carries in most offenses. But in this one, getting double-digit carries for a single running back in a Mike Leach offense is kind of substantial. He ended up having 70 yards against Missouri and a touchdown, 72 yards and a touchdown against Tulsa. But obviously, you got to talk about the pass game when talking about Mike Leach running backs. He got 10 receptions against Arkansas, 9 against A&M. Ended up having 4 receptions for 30 yards against Tulsa. So Jaquavius Marks was someone who was going to be leading the Mississippi State running game. I guess a combination of running game and being a receiver in this offense at running back. And the other is Dylan Johnson. Dylan Johnson got 51 carries for 225 yards and 4 touchdowns a year ago. Like Jaquavius Marks, was another threat in the backfield that Mississippi State turned to as Kylan Hill. His production started to wane towards the end of the year. He ended up being the most productive rusher in that game against Tulsa, had 6 carries for 57 yards. Ended up having 36 receptions for 157. And obviously that playing time, because of Kylan Hill at the beginning of the year, was a bit limited between the 2 of them. So coming into 2021, they're going to be the 2 guys at running back that Mississippi State's going to depend on, not only to run the ball, but also to catch passes. So Jaquavius Marks and Dylan Johnson are going to be the 2 workhorses at running back, I guess running back / receiver for State. And they're 2 guys who really showed some flashes of greatness a year ago, and State's looking to build on that with them this coming season.
Yeah, we're not accustomed to seeing a Mike Leach offense struggle as it did for much of the first half of the season, but caught its stride down the stretch. And one of the things that's going to give them a chance to explode, of course, is going to be the offensive line. And for the most part, it looks like it remains intact.
Yeah, most of the offensive linemen are coming back from Mississippi State. There's one offensive lineman who many Mississippi State people were hoping would have a good season last year, and that was Scott Lashley, who was a transfer from Alabama, but he ended up getting injured right before the season, a couple days before the first game of the year against LSU. Mississippi State, it was announced that he got injured, but he's going to be coming back. He decided to take a COVID year, and will be back starting for Mississippi State on the offensive line this season. Some other ones, LaQuinston Sharp is someone who's going to be a senior who's going to be starting along the offensive line. Charles Cross is a guy who was a five-star recruit out of high school, going to be coming into his redshirt sophomore year. Someone who Mississippi State is really looking to take a massive step up. Cannon Boone is someone who's going to be a true freshman this year, who's been getting some hype out of camp, as well as Albert Reese, who's another another true freshman. He's from Alberta, Canada. He's 6'7", 315 pounds, an absolute monster. Those are a couple of freshmen who actually might end up having a contribution to this Mississippi State team. But between Nick Jones, Charles Cross, LaQuinston Sharp, and Scott Lashley, although Lashley didn't end up playing last year, he's been in this offense for a bit during practice last season and now throughout training camp. Those are some guys who will be stepping up and being significant contributors in the offensive line this year, most of the guys returning. And the offensive line was a unit that sort of came in ebbs and flows last year, sort of a Jekyll and Hyde situation. As long as the offensive line was solid, Mississippi State was able to move the ball. And the games in which Mississippi State was totally stagnant on offense, the offensive line was getting flattened right out of the gate. KJ Costello never really had much time to throw beyond the LSU game. He ends up getting injured. And then Will Rogers had the exact same situation in games like Vanderbilt and Auburn. But in those wins that Mississippi State had, or I mean, even against Georgia, when Mississippi State nearly knocked off Georgia in Athens, Mississippi State's offensive line was very solid. They were solid against Missouri. They were solid against Tulsa. And Mississippi State was able to move the ball. State didn't put up crazy numbers against Tulsa, but they were still able to score and had more production than many games in the regular season. So the offensive line is in my opinion, the most critical aspect of Mississippi State's team this year. If Mississippi State is going to make it to another bowl game, hit that 6-7 win mark, the offensive line is going to have, for the most part, have a solid year. But if State's going to have a bad year, it's because the offensive line struggled. The offensive line is of the utmost importance for this air raid offense to work.
Michael Leach's teams are expected to score, but they scored on defense last year. 4 touchdowns was one of the best marks in the nation for a defense, and most of the firepower comes back next season as we start Daniel at the defensive front with Jaden Crumedy. And although you lose most of the rest of the productivity, at least up front.
Yeah, the defense was the most pleasant surprise last year. It was definitely the strength of Mississippi State's team. And a lot of that is credited to defensive coordinator Zach Arnett, someone who was formerly the defensive coordinator at San Diego State for Rocky Long. I believe he was hired by Syracuse originally, and then Mike Leach poached him to go to Mississippi State. He was considered for many defensive coordinator jobs, including Texas and Notre Dame and Oregon. But ended up staying at Mississippi State as they went in different directions. The defense, as I said, was sort of a pleasant surprise. It was expected to be the weakness of the team, and it ended up being the strength. Looking at the defensive line, you mentioned Jaden Crumedy, who's going to be returning, had 32 total tackles, 2 sacks. Definitely going to be looking to take a much bigger step forward as a leader on this defense. You also have Nathan Pickering. He didn't have a lot of production last year, but he has the talent and the potential to be one of the better players on this Mississippi State defense. You lose a guy like Marquise Spencer at the defensive line, but as guys like Nathan Pickering and Cameron Young they're going to step up and have more of a role in this defense. That's definitely where the defensive front's going to be led with Crumity, Pickering, and Cameron Young. They're going to be look for as leaders on this defense to take a step up, and I think they have the potential to do that.
And one of Mississippi State's best players on defense, Aaron Brule, comes back. He had 77 tackles. That's the best of any returning player, number 2 on the team in 2020.
Yeah, Mississippi State has sort of made a name of in the past, Mississippi State's made a name for themselves at defensive line, but last year's defense was loaded with linebackers. They're losing their leader in Errol Thompson, but you mentioned Aaron Brule, who was second on the team in total tackles, right behind Errol Thompson. Had 76 tackles, 4 sacks. 30 of those tackles were solo tackles. He's probably going to be the leader on defense. A year ago, you had guys like Errol Thompson and Marquise Spencer and Kobe Jones who were looked to as the leaders, but now this is going to be a situation where Aaron Brule is going to be that main leader on defense. Looking more at the linebacker position, Nathaniel Watson is someone who got 39 tackles, was in the upper part of the team in terms of tackles a year ago. He's going to have more of a role with the departure of Thompson and Kobe Jones. Tyrus Wheat is someone who towards the end of the season became a real threat at linebacker. He's going to be one of the team's best. So yeah, those are the 2 main guys who are going to be looked to at linebacker. Brule, Nathaniel Watson, and Tyrus Wheat are going to be leading this Bulldog linebacking corps.
And then checking out the secondary, of course, they get a lot of work in practice, so they get their reps in against a passing game, no doubt about that. Emmanuel Forbes picked off 5 last year, so he's back. And Sean Preston, one of the better safeties that you'll find in the division, he's back.
Right. You mentioned Nathaniel Forbes first. He was a true freshman a year ago, ended up having 44 tackles, 5 interceptions. 3 of them were pick sixes, 3 interceptions returned for a touchdown. He was ended up being one of the better defensive players for State a year ago, and he will be returning as the top returning corner. You mentioned Sean Preston, someone who had 65 tackles, which was 4th on the team. He didn't have an interception, but as Mississippi State last year did a very good job of forcing turnovers, and I think that Sean Preston is someone who could contribute to that this coming season. London Kraft is someone who's a safety who not many State people had really heard of coming into last season. A year ago, before that LSU game, that crazy LSU win that Mississippi State had, when Mississippi State announced the starting depth chart, London Kraft was one of the starting safeties. Not many State people were looking forward to that possibility because no one had really heard of him. But he ended up having a really, really good year, 5th on the team in tackles with 57. He's going to be someone who will be taking a step up. Colin Duncan is another safety right behind London Kraft, 6th on the team in tackles with 46, as well as 2 interceptions. So this is a secondary that, Zach Arnett runs the 3-3-5. So it's definitely a secondary heavy defense, and the secondary was able to step up last year as one of the main contributing factors of the success of this defense. And Mississippi State is pretty much bringing almost the entire secondary back from a year ago, a defense that was in the top half of the SEC in total defense. So Mississippi State's definitely going to be looking forward to the prospects of this secondary and contributing to what it will hopefully be another solid defense in 2021.
And sometimes it's a bit of a mystery when your specialists, both kicking and punting, aren't coming back. Do you have any thoughts about who's taken the lead in those competitions?
Well, the kicker is going to be Brandon Ruiz. A year ago, he was the starting kicker. He and Jace Chrisman had a bit of a battle at starting kicker. Jace Chrisman was actually the most accurate kicker in Mississippi State history until last year when Brandon Ruiz took over that position. He went 10 of 12, was 4 for 4 from between 20 and 29 yards, 2 for 2 from 30 and 39, and 4 for 5 from 40 and 49. So Brandon Ruiz considered leaving for the possibility of going to the NFL, but he ended up coming back, which is a huge relief for Mississippi State. And Jace Chrisman, who I mentioned, is actually going to be joining Dan Mullen at Florida as their starting kicker. So, there's another former Mississippi State player joining his former coach. At punter, it's probably going to be Tucker Day from Brentwood High School in Brentwood, Tennessee. Punted a year ago, dealt with some injury, but he will be coming back and will be leading the charge at punter. But I think Mississippi State special teams has not usually been a strong suit for Mississippi State, particularly in the place kicking department. But I think Brandon Ruiz is going to be bring some stability to that Mississippi State kicking game, especially going 10 of 12 from field goals. Mike Leach is not someone who necessarily likes kicking field goals. He loves to be aggressive and go for it on fourth down, which a lot of Mississippi State fans discovered in games like the Arkansas game. Also, Mississippi State was punting so frequently that the field goals weren't really that frequent. But I think Brandon Ruiz, despite not having a lot of opportunities, only 12 field goal attempts a year ago, still going 10 of 12 is very solid. And I think Mississippi State's going to be pretty stout at special teams this coming year.
Okay. We're just about 3 weeks away. Louisiana Tech in Starkville. Daniel, we appreciate you stopping by as always, breaking down the Bulldogs for us.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.